In 2020, Hollywood thought it had finally built the Netflix killer. They raised nearly $2 billion in cold, hard cash. They brought in every A-list celebrity you can name. They hired the most powerful executives in the history of entertainment, and they launched what they genuinely believed was the inevitable future of streaming. The company was called Quibi. And just 6 months later, it was dead. It wasn't just a failure. It was one of the fastest, most expensive collapses in the history of modern business. But here's the thing, Quibi didn't fail because of bad timing. It didn't fail because of a global pandemic. It failed because the people behind it fundamentally misunderstood how the internet actually works. They tried to buy the one thing you can't manufacture. They tried to buy your attention. On paper, Quibi was unstoppable. It had the kind of pedigree that made Silicon Valley VCs salivate and Hollywood legends take notice. At the helm was Jeffrey Katzenberg, the man who ran Disney during its 90s renaissance and co-founded DreamWorks. His partner? Meg Whitman, the former CEO of eBay and Hewlett-Packard. It was the ultimate power couple of content and commerce. They didn't just have a plan, they had a war chest. We're talking $1.75 billion in seed funding from every major studio: Disney, NBC Universal, Warner Brothers, Sony. Everyone wanted a piece of the next big thing. And the pitch was seductive, quick bites. They noticed a gap in the market. You have Netflix for the living room and YouTube for the bedroom, but what about the in-between moments? The 10 minutes you spend waiting for a train. The 5 minutes in line for coffee. Quibi was going to fill those gaps with Hollywood-quality content designed specifically for your phone. They even patented a technology called Turnstile, which allowed you to flip your phone between portrait and landscape modes seamlessly, with the framing of the video adjusting in real time. To pull this off, they didn't hire influencers. They hired icons. Steven Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro, Kevin Hart, Chrissy Teigen. They were spending upwards of $100,000 per minute of content. And honestly, at first glance, Quibi made perfect sense. It had the money, it had the talent, and it had a hardware-level innovation that nobody else was doing. On the morning of the launch, the mood in Hollywood was electric. They thought they had finally cracked the code. They thought they were about to colonize the only screen Netflix hadn't conquered yet, the one in your pocket. But as the saying goes, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And in this case, the enemy wasn't a competitor. It was the very audience they were trying to capture. The strategy behind Quibi was built on a single, massive gamble. They called it the 10-minute rule. Every single show, whether it was a high-budget thriller or a reality competition, had to be broken down into chapters under 10 minutes long. The idea was to create premium cinematic content that fit into the cracks of your day. It was designed for the commuter, the student between classes, and the person standing in a grocery store line. But it wasn't just about the length. It was about the delivery. Quibi was strictly mobile only. No smart TV app. No desktop version. If you wanted to watch a show starring an Oscar-winning actor, you had to watch it on a 6-inch screen. They were betting that the convenience of the phone would outweigh the prestige of the living room. They also introduced the turnstile technology as their secret weapon. It was a technical marvel that cost millions to develop. By rotating your phone, you could switch between a wide cinematic view and a vertical close-up shot without losing any of the action. It was Hollywood's way of saying we have mastered the hardware of the modern age. They were so confident in this vision that they spent hundreds of millions on marketing before the app even launched. They bought Super Bowl ads. They plastered billboards across every major city. They wanted to make sure that by the time you hit the App Store, you felt like you were missing out on a cultural revolution. But hidden inside Quibi's strategy was a massive assumption. They assumed that the reason people watched short videos on their phones was simply because the videos were short. They believed that if they took the quality of a movie theater and shrunk it down to the size of a palm, the world would naturally flock to it. They were about to find out that the internet doesn't just want shorter versions of what is already on TV. This is where the billion-dollar crack in the foundation finally gave way. Quibi copied the format of the internet without understanding the culture of the internet. The executives in the boardroom looked at the success of YouTube and TikTok and saw a math problem. They thought the secret sauce was just the duration of the clip. They figured if a teenager with a phone could get 1 million views in 60 seconds, Then a director with an $80 million budget could get 100 million views in 10 minutes. They were dead wrong. People don't go to their phones for short-form content because they want a condensed version of a movie. They go there for connection. They go there for personality, relatability, and community. On YouTube, you feel like you know the creator. On TikTok, you feel like you are part of a trend. On Instagram, you are participating in a social circle. These platforms are two-way streets. They are conversational. Quibi was a one-way broadcast. It was old Hollywood talking down to a digital generation. They banned users from taking screenshots. They made it impossible to share clips on social media. They effectively built a walled garden in an ecosystem that thrives on being open and viral. By the time they realized that people wanted to meme their shows and talk about them on Twitter, it was too late. They had treated the internet like a smaller television screen rather than a completely different world. The reality is that people don't just want shorter Hollywood shows. They want to be part of the story. And by locking their content behind a rigid, high-priced paywall with no social features, Quibi ensured that nobody would ever care enough to talk about them. Then the real world hit. Quibi launched in April 2020. At that exact moment, the entire world went into lockdown. The very foundation of the company, the in-between moments of a busy life, disappeared overnight. There were no more commutes. There were no more coffee lines. There were no more lunch breaks. Everyone was stuck at home, sitting 5 feet away from a 4K television. Suddenly, a mobile-only streaming service was the last thing anyone wanted. Why would you squint at a phone to watch a thriller when you could watch Netflix on a 60-inch screen? But the lack of a TV app was only the beginning of the disaster. The bigger issue was the product itself. Because they had banned screenshots and screen recording to protect their precious intellectual property, the app was a social media ghost. If something funny happened in a show, you couldn't share it. If there was a meme-worthy moment, it stayed trapped inside the app. In the digital age, if you can't share it, it doesn't exist. The shows were forgettable. The interface was frustrating. And the revolutionary turnstile technology? It felt like a gimmick that nobody actually asked for. Users weren't flipping their phones back and forth to see different angles. They were just trying to find something worth watching. One bad decision led to another. The momentum slowed, the buzz faded, and the App Store rankings began a terrifying slide into irrelevance. But the real disaster wasn't the pandemic. It was that nobody actually cared. The numbers started to leak and they were a bloodbath. Quibi had expected tens of millions of users to flood the platform. Instead, they found a void. Within a few months of the launch, the app had lost over 90% of its early adopters. People would sign up for the free trial to see what the hype was about, and then they would vanish before the first bill arrived. They had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on productions that were being watched by almost no one. A single video from a creator in a bedroom on YouTube was outperforming shows that cost more than a luxury mansion to produce. Internally, the panic was setting in. The leadership tried to blame the timing and the state of the world, but the truth was written in the data. Even when people were bored and stuck at home, they still chose literally anything else over Quibi. They had the money to buy every billboard in Times Square, and they had the power to put a celebrity in every thumbnail. But they found out the hard way that internet attention cannot be manufactured. You can buy reach and you can buy impressions, but you cannot buy a soul. Social media was indifferent. There was no fan art, and there were no trending hashtags. There was only a cold silence. Quibi discovered something terrifying. In a world where everyone has 1,000 options for entertainment, being boring is a much bigger sin than being expensive. They had built a billion-dollar monument to themselves, and the internet simply walked right past it without looking up. The collapse happened with stunning speed. Just 6 months after the big launch party, Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman had to make the call that every founder fears. They announced that Quibi was shutting down for good. It was one of the fastest billion-dollar failures in the history of the modern world. They had gone from the most talked-about startup in the country to a punchline in less than a year. There was no slow decline. There was no pivot to a new business model. There was only a sudden stop. They began the grim process of returning whatever cash was left to the investors who had believed the hype. The shows that cost millions were sold off to Roku for pennies on the dollar just to recoup some of the losses. The turnstile technology that was supposed to change how we see the world was tucked away in a drawer. The shutdown wasn't just a financial disaster for the people involved. It was an embarrassment for the Hollywood establishment. It proved that a massive bank account and a list of famous friends are not enough to win in the digital age. The end felt inevitable to everyone except the people in the boardroom. While the executives were still talking about the future of cinema, the rest of the world had already deleted the app and moved on. The billion-dollar ghost had finally vanished. The failure of Quibi is often blamed on the pandemic or a lack of smart TV support, but the truth is much deeper than that. The real lesson is that old media executives believed quality alone wins online. They thought that if they spent enough money and hired enough stars, the audience would be forced to follow. They viewed the internet as a container for content rather than a place for conversation. But internet culture values connection over production. It values authenticity over polish. It values participation over observation. A teenager in their bedroom talking directly to a camera creates more loyalty than a $1 million thriller that you cannot even screenshot. Creators build communities while celebrities build audiences, and in the modern world a community is much harder to kill. Quibi thought Hollywood could engineer virality. But the internet does not work like television. You can spend billions creating content and still fail if nobody cares enough to share it. They tried to buy the future using a map from the past. And the internet proved once and for all that it cannot be bought.